Welcome to this explainer. Look, imagine an empire so profoundly wealthy that its cities literally dazzled the globe. Back in 1700, the Mughal Empire is at its absolute peak. We're talking about a court that sits beneath actual ceilings of gold, managing an army of 500,000 men. It's a place where diamonds, bigger than eggs, are just sitting in royal collections, and tens of millions of people are paying taxes to an emperor who looks, well, completely unstoppable, permanent, honestly, too rich to fail. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is the sheer unbelievable scale of that wealth. It's kind of hard to wrap your head around. In 1700, the Mughal Empire was generating roughly 25% of the entire world's GDP. Think about that. 1 out of every $4 produced on planet Earth came directly from these lands. You had merchants carrying Mughal textiles and goods all the way from Asia to Africa and Europe. It was this massive global economic engine, unlike almost anything else in human history. Which brings us to a really stunning paradox, and honestly, the central question of our explainer today. How exactly does an empire go from ruling a quarter of the global economy, from sitting on a legendary peacock throne worth more than entire kingdoms, to eventually burying its final emperor, Bahadur Shah Zafar, in a completely unmarked grave in exile in Burma? Just 157 years after its peak, the last Mughal emperor was old, defeated, and banished by a foreign corporation. And here's the thing. What destroyed them wasn't one giant catastrophic invasion. It was a slow-motion chain reaction of decisions that just hollowed them out from the inside. So to really understand the fall, we have to go back to the origins. Picture this. It's 1526, and a Central Asian prince named Babar crosses the Khyber Pass with only about 12,000 men. He's facing down an army several times larger at the First Battle of Panipat, but he doesn't win with sheer numbers. Instead, he uses cutting-edge gunpowder weapons, field artillery, and some incredibly disciplined tactics. Babur just completely shatters the forces of Sultan Ibrahim Lodi, and right then and there, in that decisive moment, he lays the very first stones of what would become the mighty Mughal Empire. But Babur was just a founder. The empire's true architect was his grandson, Akbar. When Akbar took power in 1556, the state was actually incredibly fragile, and his greatest achievement, it wasn't military conquest at all. It was radical inclusion. See, the Mughal Empire contained all these different languages, religions, and cultures. Most rulers back then would try to crush that kind of diversity. Akbar did the exact opposite. He abolished the jizya tax on non-Muslims, married Rajput princesses to turn former enemies into allies, and promoted his officials based purely on ability. This wasn't just charity, right? It was a brilliant strategy to give local elites a real tangible stake in the empire's success. He basically built a machine that converted diversity into absolute strength. Okay, let's dive into this, because this is where the cracks start to show. Under Akbar and his immediate successors, trade exploded. The Taj Mahal was built, things were booming. But then in 1658, after a really brutal war of succession, a new emperor named Aurangzeb takes the throne. Now, Aurangzeb was deeply disciplined, but he brought back that jizya tax, destroyed temples, and completely reversed the very policies that had held the whole empire together. He basically thought his predecessors had compromised way too much. So gradually, the policies that once encouraged cooperation started breeding this deep, simmering resentment. Rajput alliances weakened, and new highly mobile forces, especially the Marathas, these fierce guerrilla warriors from the Deccan Plateau, started rising up and systematically challenging Mughal power. 27. That is the staggering number of years Aurangzeb spent fighting these endless, totally exhausting wars in the Deccan region down in the south. I mean, just think about that for a second. Nearly 3 decades of nonstop military campaigns. You've got armies marching endlessly, fortresses constantly under siege, and the royal treasury being utterly drained. So while Aurangzeb is down south chasing victory, revenue collection up in the north completely deteriorates. The empire was getting larger on the map, sure, but in reality, it was getting significantly weaker. And the crazy part is, by the time Aurangzeb died in 1707, even he was haunted by what he had done to his own empire. In a letter written right near the end of his life, he confessed this: "I came alone and I go as a stranger. I do not know who I am nor what I have been doing." Man, it is such a chilling deathbed confession. Because beneath all those military victories, Aurangzeb realized the brutal truth. The foundations of the empire were literally cracking beneath his feet. Well, the empire survived him, but just barely. It almost immediately entered a death spiral, defined by one catastrophic number, 12. Over a very short period, 12 different emperors would take the throne. And every single succession crisis triggered more conspiracies, assassinations, and just total political manipulation behind the scenes. And those 12 emperors, they cycled through in just 30 years, 12 emperors in 3 decades. Because of this rapid, incredibly chaotic turnover, power aggressively shifted away from the throne and went straight into the hands of corrupt nobles and kingmakers. Provincial governors basically started looking out for themselves, so the empire was still physically massive, but it no longer had a functioning center. With the center completely hollowed out and those Maratha horsemen already raiding the outskirts of the capital, the unthinkable became reality in 1739. Nader Shah, a conqueror from Persia, crosses into Mughal territory, crushes the imperial army at Karnal, and basically marches right through the front doors of Delhi. After an initial surrender, violence erupts in the streets, and Nader Shah responds with just visceral terror. For one horrifying day, the imperial capital became a slaughterhouse. An estimated 20,000 civilians were massacred. The empire that once inspired awe across the globe couldn't even defend its own citizens. And when Nader Shah finally left, he definitely didn't leave empty-handed. He carried away the wealth of an empire on caravans heading west. We're talking about stripping away the legendary peacock throne, the priceless Kohinoor diamond, and generations, literally generations, of accumulated gold and silver. But you know what? The psychological damage was infinitely worse than the financial loss. The illusion of Mughal invincibility was permanently shattered. The empire was fully exposed as a defenseless shell, and everyone around them could see the end was near. So the only question left was who's going to pick up the pieces? And the answer arrived really quietly. Not with an invading army, but with accountants. The British East India Company had actually first arrived as mere guests and merchants way back in 1612, paying taxes and following local rules. But as Mughal power declined, this corporation saw a golden opportunity to shift from ledgers to legions. As you'll see, history's most successful takeovers often happen in slow motion, driven by paperwork and administration rather than brute force. The real turning point hit in 1757 at the Battle of Plassey, and the math here is just staggering. Robert Clive commanded roughly 3,000 British troops against a massive force of 50,000. But the victory was actually won on paper before the fighting even started. Through secret meetings and heavy promises of money, key commanders like Mir Jafar were bribed. Much of that massive opposing army simply stood there and failed to act. So it wasn't really a military conquest at all. It was a hostile corporate takeover of Bengal, which was one of the richest regions in the entire world. And this all leads us to the final tragic indignity following the massive uprising of 1857. The rebels needed a symbol, right? So they chose the 82-year-old last Mughal emperor, Bahadur Shah Zafar, a guy who was honestly much more of a poet than a ruler. When the rebellion ultimately failed, the British put him on trial. He literally sat as a defendant inside his own palace. The emperor of a dynasty that had ruled for over 3 centuries was convicted by a corporation, exiled to Burma, and buried in an unmarked grave. And just like that, the empire ended in complete silence. So the crucial point is, what should you actually take away from all this? The collapse of the Mughal Empire perfectly follows these universal patterns of human behavior that apply right up to the modern day. First up, leadership. Valuing ideological purity over actual competence will destroy your ability to solve problems. Second, succession. Without clear rules for transitions, every single change in power turns into a fatal crisis. Third, endless frontier wars just consume your resources while the center rots away. And finally, outside powers rarely announce a conquest. They usually arrive offering trade, partnership, and efficiency, right up until they become absolutely indispensable. It really all boils down to one stark reality. No institution is ever too rich to fail. The Mughal Empire is this profound cautionary tale of a dynasty that built its incredible wealth by uniting millions through inclusion, only to slowly destroy itself through division, sheer exhaustion, and the blinding illusion that its power would simply last forever. They believed decline was something that happened to other people, until it happened to them. But hey, if you think that's where the story ends, it absolutely isn't, because the massive vacuum left behind by the fall of the Mughals would go on to reshape the lives of hundreds of millions of people. In our next explainer, we're going to cover the traumatic aftermath that followed decades later, the 1947 partition, where borders were drawn by a man who had literally never been to India, leaving 10 million displaced and 2 million dead. The past is never really gone, guys. It's just waiting for us to notice its echoes. So looking at the superpowers of our world today, which ones do you think are already blinding themselves to their own decline?